Today's daf we're going to be learning is about Zarah daf mem. We're going to continue from where we were up to in the Mishnah. The Mishnah talked about a taritcha and a trufa. If you had non-chopped up fish, in the previous Mishnah we were concerned with the chopped up fish, that you couldn't take them from Gentiles because maybe they mix in non-kosher fish, but the fish aren't chopped up, then you can. And we had the tzir sheyesh badaga, which is the brine, which has a fish in it, which is a way that they would identify what kind of fish it came from. So if it had a fish in it, then again, it would be permitted. So we're now going to see a braita about this, which we started yesterday. Tanu Rabbanan Ezu Tarik Te'en Tufa Kol Rosh V'Shidra Nikar. Right, as long as you can identify the head and the spinal cord, then we know it's not chopped up. That's considered not chopped up because if that part is still intact. Ezu Tzir She'en Badaga. What's a tzir that doesn't have fish in it? Sheyesh Badaga that has a fish in it. What's considered has a fish in it? We have a fish called a kilbit is floating in it. That was a sign that the fish, okay, either because the kilbit was a kosher fish, so it was a sign that there's kosher, the brine was made from kosher fish. So one or two. So the Gemara asked the obvious question: if one kilbit's enough, why do they have to mention two? Why does it say one or two? It should just be one. Once there's one, obviously two is right. One is part of two. So lo kashya, kam beptuchot, kam bestumot. Rashi says, and there's some people explain this the opposite way, but we're going to go with Rashi right now. Lo sagi bechada, one is not enough. If it's open, we're concerned that maybe the kilbit fell in from somewhere else. And we're going to see later that open ones where it was concerned that the fish jumps in, jumps out. Perhaps these were live fish and they could move. So or maybe just fell in there. There was a concern that they would move in and out. So if there's one in the open ones, that's not enough. You need two. Because one might be it just fell in there. But once there's two, you know for sure. If it's sealed, well then what was the fish doing in there, right? It doesn't just jump in if the barrel is sealed. So one, it would be enough for the sealed ones. Itma. So now we're going to have a machloket about this rosh and shidra. Okay, we talked about the taritcha and a trufa. If it's not chopped up, it means the head and the spinal cord are intact. Rav Huna amar, ad shtei rosh v'shidra nikah. So Rav Huna says you need both the head and the spinal cord. One of them is not enough. Rav Nachman amar, o rosh o shidra. He understands it's either just the head or the spinal cord. It's not both. So as long as you have one. Okay, now the assumption here, and this is going to be a little bit tricky because until now we kind of thought that not chopped up, it's just a definition. If it's not chopped up, then right, this stuff is intact. But the issue is going to be that this is an identifying feature of a kosher fish. Okay, and we're gonna try to understand now. There's two ways to understand this. One way is to understand that if the head and the spinal cord are intact, then you can identify. There's an assumption that you know which fish are kosher, which fish are not kosher, and as long as the pieces are big enough, meaning, i.e., the head or the spinal cord or both are intact, then you can identify it as kosher fish. We call this tfiat ayin. It means by just looking at it, you can have a sense of what it is. If there's less than that in there, you won't be able to identify it. Some people think that it means that if the head and the spinal cord are intact, it allows you to identify if there is a spinal cord and what size the head is. And those are signs of kosher fish. Okay? We understand that the second way, the next sentence is very obviously clear what it means. Understand the first way, we still have to kind of figure out exactly what this means. But now the assumption is that kosher fish had certain shaped heads and they had spinal cords. Remember we saw before, if the waters weren't salty, right? Why were they not concerned there were non-kosher fish there? Because the waters were salty and perhaps, right, because the fish without spinal cord, the waters were moving fast. Fish without spinal cords can't function in fast-moving rivers. And then, right, that was the Nahar Bav, how we know that anything that came from Nahar Bav was kosher. And then we said that because non-kosher fish don't have spinal cords, and that's why they can't function. Without a spinal cord, you can't function in a fast-moving river. Okay, so with a spinal cord, you can, and that was how we knew that kosher fish. In the end, we said that it wasn't true. But the concept that perhaps they don't have spinal cords if they're not kosher is a concept here that is raised again, as if that's a sign of a kosher fish. So, Mativ Rav Ukva Brahama Ubedagim Kosher Tapir V'Kaskesed. What do you mean? The rush and the shidra, the identifying marks. Don't we say it's scales and fins? That's how you identify, not by the size of its head and the fact whether it has a spinal cord or not. That's if we go with the second interpretation. If we go with the first interpretation, there's just that you can identify the fish. So if we go with that if you have the head or the spine, the spinal cord, or both intact, right? Then depending on which which side of the machloket you're on, then it seems like you can identify the fish just by looking at that. You don't need to check for fins and scales. And the Mishnah here says you need to check for scales and fins. So that's a different way to understand this contradiction. Okay, just so you understand, there's two different ways to read this sugya. So Amrabai, Kitanya hi ba'ara upumuda, the dama rashayu litmei. So they say that Mishnah about the scales and the fins is specifically in certain types of fish that actually look like non-kosher fish. And because of that, the only way to identify them is scales and fins. Otherwise, if you can, in a regular fish that has a different look, okay, their head is different shape and that's whatever it might be, depending on which interpretation you go by. But the other fish look like kosher fish, we can go by. They look like kosher fish. You don't have to find the scales and the fins. But in the ones that look like non-kosher fish, the only way to make them kosher is to identify them either by having scales or fins. By scales and fins. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda Mishmei De'ula. Machloket l'tabel b'tziran. So now there's machloket between them. Do you need the head or the spinal cord, or do you need both? So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Ula that their machloket is specifically when it comes to dipping in brine from those fish, which is already a lot more lenient because you're not actually eating the fish itself, you're just eating the brine. Aval begufan divrei kol asul. But when it comes to eating the body of the fish, right, you want to eat the fish itself, of course it's forbidden, ad shei rosh v'shidrani kar. You definitely have to identify for sure. The brine is the only thing we're going to be more lenient with, as long as it looks like you can somewhat identify partially head or spinal cord, but you don't need both. But to eat the fish itself, you need both. Now we're going to get to some halacha l'maaseh. So Amar Rabbi Zarah, Mereish hava mitbilinam b'tziran. So originally I was dipping it in the tzir, even though it had the head, or in other words, it only had the head or the spinal cord identifiable. But Keren de Shamana lahad Amar Rav Yehuda Mishmei De'ula. But once I heard what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Ula that machloket l'tabel b'tziran, that the machloket is in that case ava begufan divrei hakol asur ad shei rosh v'shidran yikar. Then I saw that he said their argument is not only about their argument is only about the tzir, but when it comes to the body of the fish, you can't eat it unless you have both. So then b'tzira nami lo mitbalina. Then I said, you know what? I better be more stringent and go with the more strict opinion in the brine, because since in the body they all agree it's a problem unless you have both, I'm going to be more strict in the tzir and hold by the more strict position. Amar Rav Papa hilchata ad shtei rosh shidrani karsha kol echat ve'echat. Rav Papa even goes farther to say the halacha is until you have the rosh and the shidra of every single fish that was used in that brine. That you have to be able to identify all the fish in the brine and have the head and the spinal cord be noticeable of all the fish that are in the brine, and otherwise you can't. Now, you can't just say, oh, it's got one kosher fish, let's just assume the brine is kosher. He says you have to have you have to make sure that you see, again, and not only just see the head or the spine of one of them, or head or spine of all of them. No, you have to see the head and the spine of any fish that might be in the brine. So he had the most strict position. Meitve. Now we have a contradiction. חתיכות שיש בהם סימן, בין בכולם בין במקצתן. If you have pieces that have a siman, whether on all of them or whether on some of them, ואפילו באחד ממאה שבהן כולם מותרות. Okay, so now we have a case. Or Papa said you have to see all of them. Now we have a case where we have these pieces that have a siman, that they're kosher. Whether all of them or even some of them, we can assume even 1/100th of them, we can assume that other fish that are with it are all kosher. So, umaseh b'ovei kochavim, and there was a case of a Gentile. Echad shevi gerev shel chatichot. He brought a jug full of, or a barrel full of cut up pieces. V'nimtza siman be'echad mehem, meaning again, it was identifiable, head or spinal cord, or maybe both. V'yitirash bagat gerev kulo, and he said the whole thing is kosher. So how do you explain that in light of our Papa, who said you have to see all the fish in the brine and make sure you can identify all of them? So Tirgum of Papa Kshat Chatichot Shavot. Okay, Rav Papa explained this source as saying that's only when the pieces are all identical, and you could tell they all came from the same fish. So okay, if they're all identical, then why does the Brighton need to tell you all those details that one is enough? Of course, one is enough. They're all the same. Well, you might have thought maybe you have to worry. Maybe something got mixed in. No, you don't have to worry. There was a boat full of cut up pieces of tzachanta. It got to a place named Sichla. Nafik Rav Huna bar Chinina. So Rav Huna bar Chinina goes out to the boat. And he saw scales on the side of the boat. So he said, this must be kosher fish. Amalei Rava said to Rav Huna bar Chinina, Umi kadeshari ki agavna, ba'atre deshchiche kalfe. He said, why would you permit this? It's a place where there's a lot of fish with scales, and the scales that you see on the boat could come from other fish. It's not necessarily from the ones that are in this boat. Nafik Shipura de Rava v'Aser. So come out the Rava with the shofarot, blowing on shofarot to tell everybody they're forbidden. Shipure de Rav Huna bar Chinina v'Share. Well, came out the shofarot of Rav Huna bar Chinina, and he made the big announcement that they were permitted. So we have this big debate between these two rabbis, and each one trying to make a public display that these are permitted, no, these are forbidden. Amar Rabbi Yirmi Amidifti, Ladidi Amar Li Rav Papi. So Rabbi Yirmi Amidifti says, I heard from Rav Papi. V'kishari Rav Huna bar Chinina b'tziran. Now we have, as we know, stories get passed down, and they always get passed down in a bit of a different, messed up details. So Rav Yirmi Amidifti says, Rav Papi with a yud. Papi told me that when Rav Huna bar Chinina permitted this with his shofarot, it was the brine, but begufan lo, but he wouldn't permit eating the actual fish. Because again, they were cut up pieces, they weren't fully identifiable. Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says, Ladidi, Amali Rav Papa, Kishari. So I heard from Rav Papa that Kishari Rav Huna bar Chinina afilu begufan. Where Rav Huna bar Chinina permitted it, he permitted even the fish itself. He permitted eating the fish, not just the brine. But the Ana lo Meser Asrina de Karmali Rav Papa. So on the one hand, I'm not going to forbid it because Rav Papa said it's allowed. On the other hand, lo mishra sharina, but on the other hand, I also can't forbid it. Which kind of is tricky because if he's not going to forbid it, and he's also not going to permit it, then in the end, he really is forbidding it. But what's the issue? Because deha amar Rav Yehuda mishmei de'ula, because I know what Rav Yehuda says in the name of Ula that we already saw. The machloket letabel b'tziran, the whole machloket, rosh or shidra and all that, is if you dipped it in the brine. But begufa, divrei hakol ad she'rosh v'shidra nikar shel kol echad ve'echad. But when it comes to the fish itself, you have to see the head and the spine of every single fish. So based on what Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Ula, I also can't permit this fish. So it was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place and didn't have what to do. Yativ Rav Chinina bar Adi kamed Rav Ada bar Ava v'yativ v'kamar. So now Rav Chinina bar Adi is sitting in front of Rav Chinina bar Adi in front of Rav Ada bar Ava and says, Ove kochavim shevi areva mele'ah chaviyot. We're back to this kilbit. So you have an Ovei Kochavim who brought a barrel all full of brine, and there's a kilbit in one of them. So we have a whole bunch of different barrels. There's in one of them. Ptuchot kulam mutarot. Anything that's open is permitted. Now we go back to the ptuchot. He's actually going to be more lenient in the ptuchot because he's going to say stumot hi muteret bekulan asurot. In the stuma one, if the kilbit's inside that one, the sealed one, so we're going to permit it. And that's based on what we said before. If it's sealed and there's one, that's enough. But what's the issue? But only that one, not all the others. However, if they're open, normally we say you need two kilbits. But if there's one, it's enough actually, according to this, to permit all the open barrels because there's an assumption there was kilbit and it could be it jumped from one to the other, and it could be it left that one, but there's no reason to think that it also isn't a kosher fish brine, which seems to go against the earlier sugya that was more stringent about the open ones, which leads some people to think that the open ones actually they're more lenient about, and the closed ones they're more strict about. And that when we said before, this is in ptuchot, this is in stumot, it's actually the reverse. Or it's just, again, here the issue is that we assume all the others could have been kosher and the fish jumped from one to the other. And again, because it's the brine, it's not the actual fish, there's more reason to be lenient. Amar le Menalachai said, where do you get this from? And maybe he was also surprised by it. It sounds a little surprising. To which he answers, Ha mitzvata krai shmiale. I heard it from three. Now, krai usually means psukim. Some people think it means something else here, like 3 liters. and it's not from the source of psukim. Some people say these three leaders are kind of like three psukim. They're such big Torah scholars, as you'll see in a minute. I learned it from Mirav, Shmuel, or Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, from the three great scholars of their generation, right? They all permitted this. Amarav, Brona, Amarav. Now we're moving on to kirbei dagim, which is the fat inside the dagim, the fat from the fish, and ubaram, which are the fish eggs. Ein nikchim element of mumcha. They can only be purchased from an expert. So Rami ale Ula l'Rabbi Dostai d'min biri. But Ula brought a question on this in front of Rabbi Dostai d'min biri. Now, the fact that he says that the fat of the fish, or if you're going to buy the fat or the fish eggs, you have to check them. It has to be from an expert who can tell you, I clearly identify these as having come from kosher fish. It sounds like a non-kosher fish has eggs. Now, what's the problem? This contradicts the following source. Dag tameh, again, another kind of sign of difference between kosher and non-kosher fish. Dag tameh mashritz, dag tahor matil beitzim. Okay, a non-kosher fish mashritz, which means it births its young. Okay, meaning they come out born. And a dag tahor matil beitzim, and a kosher fish lays eggs. And therefore, if you have fish eggs, we should know already they're always from kosher fish. So they say smei mikanu baran. Okay, get rid of. Okay, the idea is mashritz also. They assume it's just born without eggs. So they say smei mikanu baran. So Rabbi Dostai d'min biri says just get rid of ubaran here. It's a mistake. It should just say kirbei dagim ein krim element mulcha, but not the fish eggs. Fish eggs are obviously kosher. You don't need anyone to say, oh, these eggs are kosher and identify them because they're all kosher. But Amalei Rabbi Zera lotus mate. Okay, don't erase this. You just misunderstood. All fish lay eggs. It's just that, or have eggs, I should say. The kosher fish lay eggs, and the eggs come out, and then the fish are born from there. So those are the fish eggs, the one type of fish eggs. There's other fish eggs that there's an egg inside the fish. It's just that the fish gives birth, right? The egg is inside and kind of breaks inside, and out comes the fish. So theoretically, if you were to catch a fish and open it up and there were eggs inside, those would be non-kosher fish eggs because those come from non-kosher fish. So therefore, there is an idea that you need to identify which fish this came from. So they say, but lama mumcha livdok b'simanim. We have a different question. Why do you need a mumcha? Livdok b'simanim. You should be able to check with simanim, identifying features. Detanya, because it says k'simanei beitzim kach simanei dagim. Okay, just like there's simanim in eggs of birds, also there's simanim in fish. So they say, wait a minute. Simanei dagim salkadatach, simanei dagim snapir v'kaskesek tibu. Wait. This can't mean that the same identifying features of the eggs of birds are the same as in fish. Fish have their own identifying marks, scales, fins. Okay, that can't possibly be. Ella, fine, just fix this. We're just like in a little tangent here because something didn't make sense here. And then we'll be back to our issue. Ella, k'simanei beitzim, kach simanei ubarei dagim. What we really tried to say is that the signs of kosher birds, the fish with birds, right, are the same signs you need for in other words, the eggs. The eggs of what did I say before? I don't know, fish birds. I think I just said the wrong word. But what I mean is the signs of kosher eggs of birds are the same signs of kosher eggs of fish. Okay, now we're going to see what that is. Eluhen simanei beitzim, kosh koderet v'algugolet rosha chad kad v'rosha chad chad. Okay, we need it. It's pointed or narrow and rounded. Okay, and one side is wider and one side is pointed. Okay, so it's wide and round, and then it has one side that's rounded, that's wider, and one side that's pointed. It's like a regular egg we have in our fridges, the ones that we use. Okay, that egg is narrow on one side and wider at the bottom, right, or at the top, whatever you say. So now they're going to say, so that's the same for fish eggs. So that's Torah. Shnei rashim chadim, shnei rasha chadim, shnei rasha kadim. But if both sides are pointed or both sides are wide, then tme'ah. Another sign, chalmomi b'chutz v'chalmomi b'fnim. If the yolk is on the outside and the white is on the inside, We know that's tmeah. Those are not our eggs. Chalmon mibachutz v'chalmon mibifnim tahor. But if the yolk is in the middle and the white is on the outside, that's a kosher egg. Okay, so again, same for fish eggs, same for bird eggs. Chalmon v'chalmon muravim ze b'zeh, zoe beitzat hasheretz. Okay, an egg from a sheretz, one of the 8 creepy crawlers that are forbidden, a sign of that is when the egg and the white are mixed in together. I don't know the reality of any of this, okay? I didn't have time to start researching it all, but this is obviously what they perceived as the reality of their time. So now we're back to the question. If there's clear simanim of fish eggs, then why do we need a mumche, an expert? So I'm a Rebbe, kisheni mochu. But this is a good question, but the egg is melted, okay? Where maybe it's just not identifiable anymore. Maybe you don't have the shell on it anymore. Exactly what that means, I assume it's something like that. Again, hard to understand the reality of this, but there would be a situation where you won't be able to identify those signs. Ula Rabbi Dostaidim in Biri. Now go back to the first opinion. He said Smei Mikan, right? Shamar Smei Mikan Ubaran. Get rid of the Ubaran because there is no such thing as fish eggs of non-kosher birds. They don't have, of non-kosher fish. They don't have eggs. V'hatanya. Well, how can you say that? Doesn't it say? We just learned in the Braita, turning out on the bed. Kis simanei betzim kach simanei ubarei dagim. Right? The same simanim as eggs. These are the same as the simanim for the ubarei dagim, right? Again, this was the changed version of the Braita, if you remember, right? Meaning fish eggs have the same identifying kashrus marks as bird eggs. So they say, and then that means it means that there are identifying features of kosher, non-kosher fish eggs. And Rabbi Dostai said there aren't. So so he answers, didn't they already change the wording of that? Kach simanei kirbei dagim. Read that Braita as these are the simanim for the fish, for the fat in the fish, not the fish eggs. Okay, it has nothing to do with the fish eggs. Now this is a little bit strange because then it comes out the signs, the shape of kosher eggs, bird eggs, is the same as the shape of the fat, right? The innards that come from the fish. Okay, that's a little weird. Why would it be egg shaped? So so they say, well, we're talking about the innards really, like the intestine. Okay, before we called it fat, but now they seem to say this is really the intestines of the fish. It needs to be wide on one side, narrow with the other. You find this actually in the bladder. Okay, if you're talking about a part of the innards of the fish, you could have it in the bladder where that's the size. Okay, and im ein shamum chemai. Okay, now they say, so that would be a sign, that would be how Rabbi Dostai, who doesn't think there's such a thing as fish eggs that aren't kosher, would have to explain that other Braita where we compared it. We said we brought this in to explain before the other opinion. How would he explain that Braita according to his opinion? So now they say, what if im ein shamum chemai? So what do you do if there is no mumche? So Amar Rav Yehuda, they feel like, okay, well, we're not going to not let you eat them, so let's figure out another solution. Okay, if you hear the owner who's trying to sell it to you says, listen, I salted it. I know it's a kosher fish, you can trust them. Rav Nachman Amar, Ad Shomar, Elu Dagim Ve'elu Kirbehem. Okay, you have to actually see the fish. He has to tell you, the storekeeper, these are the fish I took, and this is, this is their innards, meaning showing it actually where the fish came from so that you could see the actual kosher fish. It's not enough to just say, listen, I salted them, they're kosher. Ore le Rav Yehuda la'ada dayala. Okay, dayala is like steward. So Rav Yehuda told Ada, who was the steward, who basically was in charge of the food, now the person in charge of the food was the one doing the shopping. So Rav Yehuda told him, listen, all you really need is for the person to say, I salted them, and that's enough. Now we're back to the Mishnah. Next case. Okay, this is this chiltit. We were worried if you cut it that the fat from the knife would go in, and the sharpness of the cutting of it and the sharpness of the chiltit the flavor would be absorbed. It would be no tein tal l'shvach, and it would be forbidden because if you use the Gentiles cut it with their knives might have non-kosher fat in it. But the leaves of the chiltit are permitted. So the Gemara says, pshita, obviously they weren't cut. What would be the issue? Well, lo nisra ela lekartin shebo. We're worried that there might be some slivers of something on it. Maybe you're worried that those slivers on it were actually cut by the Gentile, and you might accidentally eat them. these things that probably fell on it, their leaves, and while they were attached to the ground, probably some things fell on it, and you don't have to assume that it was cut pieces that came from the Chiltit or something, and that maybe were cut by the Gentile. Okay. Other things in the Mishnah that are permitted. Say, take glus kaot hamagugalim. These are these olives that are softened and kind of pressed. Pshita, isn't it obvious? Because what else is on them? It's just olives with their oil. Well, lo nitzcha elada filu rafi derafi tuva, even if they're really soft. Sorry, afagav derafi tuva, even though they're really soft. Mao ditem achamaramebu. You might be concerned that maybe they poured some oil, some wine on it, which then would be wine from Gentiles. Kamash malan, no. It comes to teach you. Hane machmat mishchahu derafu. It's from their own oils that they got really soft. It's not from wine. Rabbi Yossi Amar Shlachin Asurin. These are overripe olives. Hechidam Shlachin. What would be the case? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina Kosha Ochzobi Adova Galina Tonishmeted. If you hold it in your hand and the pit falls out, right? You know when you get really soft olives, the pit is already separated from the inside, and then that would be a problem because those were generally had wine mixed in with them. Chagavim Habaim. Now we have these chagavim that come from the if you remember, they come from just want to remember the words, the chagavim that come from the slula or asurim, right from the basket, are forbidden because they would put oil on them, wine on them. Menaheptek mutarim, but if they were in the storage house, they hadn't yet poured the wine on them at that point, so they wouldn't be forbidden. So Tanu Rabbanan, we're going to bring a bright on this topic. Chagavim, va'kafrisim, va'kaflotot. Okay, kafrisim are capers, kaflotot are leeks. Haba'im and ha'otzal, these are things that, again, technically maybe they put wine on them. So if they're in the storage area or minaheptek, these are two different kinds of storage areas. Uminasfina, or on the boat, mutarim, because people didn't put the wine on them. However, hanim kalim bekaltuza, if they're sold in the shuk, lifnechem bani, before the storekeeper, asulim, lifnei shemizalef yayin alehem, because people would spritz wine on them. V'chein yein tapuchim shel avodah kochavim. Again, the same thing with this wine made from apples. So wine made from apples is not a problem because they didn't offer it up to their gods. So again, haba'im min ha'otzal u'min ha'heptek u'min ha'slula mutarim. Even in the basket, these are permitted. However, hanim karba katluza, if they're sold in the katluza, in the shuk, asur mipnei shabar bivim bo yain. Because again, there they put wine with them. Tanu Rabbanan. Here's a story about yein tapuchim, and specifically eaten from Gentiles. Pam echad chash Rebbe mebe'av. Rebbe was very sick. If you remember, he had a lot of stomach issues, particularly at the end of his life. Amar klumi shadam sheyodea yein tapuchim shel avdei kochavim asur mutar. He says, there's somebody who knows whether I can have this wine from apples of Gentiles or not, and then I can have that to cure me. Amar lefanav Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi said, listen, I'll tell you a story. Pam echad chash abba me'av. My father Rabbi Yossi had a problem with his stomach. Heviu lo yein tapuchim shel avdei kochavim shel shiv'im shana. They brought him wine tapuchim that was 70 years aged. V'shata, and he drank it. V'nitrapeh, and he was healed. Amar lo kol kach haya biyadcha v'tama tza'areni. Said, you had this secret all these years. You knew about this 70-year-old wine that was going to solve these problems of people having these big stomach issues, and you didn't tell me. How could you not have told me this? Okay, forget about the fact that it's permitted, but why didn't you tell me this thing about the 70-year-old wine? So, but ku umatzu ovei kochavim echad, they found one Gentile, shayu lo shlosh me'ot garbei yain shel tapuchim, he had 300 jugs of this wine made from apples, shel shivim shana, that was 70 years aged, v'shata v'nitrapeh, and Rebbe was healed. He found it and he drank it based on Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi's suggestion. Amar Baruch HaMakom Shemasaru Lamola Shomrim. He said, wow, Baruch HaMakom, right? Blessed is God that gave his world to Shomrim. And here we have this Gentile who watched over this for 70 years and basically helped me out of my pain. Okay, obviously, it wasn't a cholesh yesh bo sakana. It wasn't in danger. Otherwise, for sure, he would be able to drink it. But, right, the whole reason he was able to drink it is because there was no concern. There was wine in it, right? And it helped heal him, right? He could have lived without it. He was just having bad stomach pains. It wasn't life-threatening or anything. Okay, the last line of the Mishnah, B'chein l'truma, which we didn't really understand. So we said that the chagavim that come from the slula are forbidden, from the heptek, from the storage area, mutarin. Same thing for truma. So what are we talking about here? My b'chein l'truma. Amar Rav Sheshe, v'chein l'kohen hachashud limkol truma l'shem chulin. Also a kohen. There's sometimes kohenim who were suspect that they're selling their truma in the shuk for a higher price. Truma always goes on the marketplace for less money because only kohenim can buy it. But he was pretending it wasn't truma and he was selling it in the shuk. So Lifanav hudasu. If he's selling it in a store right in front of him, and presumably not a large amount, so you have room in the store for a lot. So we're concerned you can't buy it. But if it's in the storage house, either which kind of storage house or even in the baskets, it's permitted. Why is that? Irtute mirtat, because he's going to be scared to sell it. Because why? If the rabbis catch on to me, they're going to forbid all of it, right? They're going to confiscate all my truma. So they don't want to lose so much. Okay, Rashi says, what does it mean? Mafsidu minai yafkiu et kol haotzar. They'll say this whole thing is hefker. The rabbis have the power to just say your money's not yours anymore, and they'll take away everything in my storage house. Now, if you sell a small amount in your store, so you're willing to risk that because hopefully you could sell it and make more money, and hopefully no one will catch you. But you're not willing to risk everything you have in your storage house. And that's again a difference between something. There's a difference in halacha between the storage house, where we're not worried about certain things, and in the store where we are worried. And with that, Hadran alach mamidim. And with that, we start the next chapter. We're almost done with our daf, and then we'll go back and summarize everything. All statues are forbidden. You can't benefit at all from a statue because, like, let's say, I don't know, you want to get shaded by it, let's say, or some sort of benefit. You can't because they worship them once a year. That's what Rabbi Meir says. The only ones they worshipped, according to the rabbis, is the ones that had a stick or a bird or a ball. Those were the ones people worshipped. Any other statue, you don't have to worry about it. From Shimon Gamliel Omer, Av Kol Sheyesh Biyado Kol Davar. Three opinions. He says, as long as the person in the statue is holding something, doesn't matter what it is, those were the kinds that were worshipped. So the Gemara starts off and says, I don't get it. If they're worshipped once a year, then what are the rabbis permitting it? I'm right, the ones that don't have a stick or a ball or a bird in its hand. In the place where Rabbi Meir lived, they would worship them once a year. Rabbi Meir, we've seen this many times, Rabbi Meir is always concerned for the minority. So, therefore, he lived in a place where they worshiped them once a year. Now, not all the other places were like that. However, since he's always concerned for the minority of maybe there's a possibility, Gazar Shar Mekomot Atu Otomakom. He forbade statues from anywhere, even places where they didn't worship them. The rabbi said, look, I understand in the place where you live, fine, statues are forbidden to benefit from. But the place where we live, we're not worried that maybe it's going to be forbidden like the other ones. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, another limitation, we're only talking about statues of kings. Those are the ones that people worship, right? You go around the world, you see these statues of kings, and Rashi even says after the kings would die, Kshamelech met, Osim Surato Bepetach Hashar, they would put it in the gate in the entranceway of the city, and then people will worship those. Those are the kind of people who will worship, or sometimes will worship, depending on where. And Amar Rabbi Barchan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Uba Umdin al Petach Medina Shaninu. And we're talking about the ones at the entrance, as Rashi said, at the entrance to the city. So it would have to be both king, according to Shmuel, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, it would also have to be standing in the entrance of the city. Okay, we'll continue with our chapter and that whole issue in tomorrow's daf and further on. For now, we're just going to do a review. We have a lot of different disjointed things. We talked about the kilbeat, floating, and the difference between the open and the closed ones, even though we saw there were two different opinions about that. We had the rosh and the shidra, whether you need one or the other, or both, whether you need both to identify in the chopped up fish. Then we had a whole thing about is that a siman for a kosher fish or not? And from there we had this whole machloket. Is the machloket about just the brine, or is the machloket also about the fish itself? Perhaps even the fish itself, one or the other, or perhaps the fish itself, no, we're going to be more strict. Nobody thinks that that's okay. You would need both. A much more clear identifying. Maybe you need, if there's a mix of fish, you have to know all the fish. You could see the Rosh of the Shidra. We saw all range of opinions here. We saw a case where Rav Huna Bar Chinan and Rava were in big disagreement about these fish that came on the boat that were cut up, and whether you needed what kind of identifying marks you needed. And then we went into the kirbei dagim and the uvaran that need a mumche. And then we said, well, even though they need a mumche, maybe they don't really need a mumche. And then we also said fish, eggs, there is no such thing as non-kosher fish eggs. And then we said, well, there's two approaches to that, whether there are, whether there aren't. We had that whole debate, and whether we have identifying marks of kosher fish eggs or not. Okay, we had that. And from there, we went back to the Mishnah with the chiltit and did they take loose code, and all those cases, we went why they're forbidden or why they're permitted. All really concerns for wine. That really became the big issue after the chiltit, which was a different issue, but all the rest became issues of wine. Maybe they put wine in it. And from there, we got to the wine of tapuchim that Rebbe used, right? And we had that whole difference between things in the storehouse and things actually in the store, which is a bit of a different issue because once they're in the store, there was more concern of wine. And then we just ended with this issue of statues and what kind of statues are forbidden to benefit from, and depends maybe where you live or if you're choshesh l'miuta or not choshesh l'miuta, right? Worried about the minority of situations, possibilities, or we don't really worry about that and we just go by majority. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.